This podcast is proud to be sponsored by Tuvu. Tuvu connects people, families, and communities on their values based social media platform. There's no ads, no explicit content, just fun. Check it out at tuvu.com. Before the mid 1800s, Americans were among the most highly educated people in the world. This was before public education was introduced in the United States. Well, today, author Alex Newman will give us an insightful and even shocking history lesson into the foundations of government education. Stay with us.
You know, I've never really felt comfortable sharing pictures of my kids on social media. Then I found Tuvu, a premium social app with an actual, authentic community. No bots, no one trolling me or my family. Just clean, wholesome content you can trust.
Welcome to the Moms for America podcast. Each week, special guests tackle the issues facing the moms of America today. Discussions include personal stories and advice on how moms can build a strong foundation of faith, family, and freedom in their homes and country. Hi, moms. I'm Debbie Curlitis, your host, and thank you for joining us again today on the podcast. We're so glad every week when you come by. Right here on the top of the show, we do want to invite you to like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Another incredible podcast coming up today. Also here at the top of the show, we want to invite you to join the movement. So if you have never joined Moms for America, please join us. We are a great group of mamas all across the country uniting to fight for our faith, family, freedom, and the Constitution. So I want to go ahead and invite you to check us all out at momsforamerica.us. Sign up for the newsletter, join the movement, and be a part of our tribe. Also, if you have any ideas or topics or questions about the podcast, go ahead, email me at podcast@momsforamerica.net. I would love to hear from you. Already on to today's program. Well, Mama Bears, we are talking about a very important topic today, our kids' education. My guest today is Alex Newman. If you don't know Alex, well, today is the day. He is an award-winning journalist, educator, author, speaker, and media host. He writes for multiple publications and platforms and is the CEO of Liberty Sentinel Media. Today, we are talking about his book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. Well, welcome, Alex, to the Moms for America podcast. Boy, are we glad to have you on the show.
Well, it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, you know, our moms have been following you. You spoke at our summit. You've been on different teachings with Kelly Coles. I mean, we've been utilizing your information for quite a while, and it is amazing. But here at the top of the show, real quick, I just want to get a little bit background of you. Are you a dad? A little bit about who you are and what you've been doing so our moms can officially meet you.
Well, thank you. And so, I always say most importantly, I am a follower of Jesus Christ. And second most important, I'm a husband. I've got 5 children. Actually, number 6 arrives in July. So we
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. We're incredibly blessed to have 6 children, and we homeschool them, of course. So we are homeschool parents and wouldn't trade it for the world. My job, on paper, I'm a journalist, although I wear so many hats, it looks quite ridiculous. So I got a lot of different titles, different work that I do, but primarily in journalism and education. And the reason I settled on education as like the central focus of my work is just because it's the most important topic. You know, they say politics is downstream from culture, and that's true, but culture is downstream from education. So that's kind of like the headwaters. And I do believe it's the most important issue facing parents, facing families, facing the church, and facing our country. I also think it's the one issue that if we lose on this, we're going to lose on every other issue. We're going to lose our children, our families, our churches, our country, our freedoms. And so that's why it's been such a big focus of my work. I've taught for many, many years, and I just think it's just critical that we get this right. So,
right, the hearts, the minds, the souls of our children, us too as parents. But this is really what changes the culture and can have a country survive or a country fail, clearly.
Hmm.
So, okay, let's get into all this history. We've got buckle up, mamas. This is something you've got to hear from beginning to end here. I'm going to start with talking about public education system in America. Even though homeschooling is on the rise, the majority of parents are still sending their kids to public schools. Many of my friends are. Why do you think that is, given the public school systems are failing academically, and now we're have such an indoctrination problem? And the stats aren't good here in America, clearly.
No, they're terrible. In fact, according to the government itself, less than one third of the children in the government schools are even proficient in any core subject. So the one thing
Unbelievable.
parents actually expect the schools to do, teach their children how to read, write, do math, maybe some basic science and history, civics, that's not happening. And that's
Mm-mm.
not Alex Newman's opinion. That is what the federal government is telling you itself based on their National Assessment of Educational Progress. And so the question of why parents continue to send their children there, I think there's a number of factors. And I hate to keep using cliches, but I really think we're dealing with the frog in the boiling water. So
Mm.
the water has been progressively heated up over a period of generations, right? We're now four, maybe five generations into this massive experiment in government education, and it's gotten worse over a long period of time. And so every
Right.
generation says, wow, things have really gone downhill from, I had a great education, but my poor children or my poor grandchildren. And of course, they think they had a great education because they don't have any reference point. They don't know what
Mm.
education looked like before the government took it over. And so it gets a little bit worse and then a little bit worse. And it's also kind of a cultural institution. It's, we all grew up in this environment. It's just what people do. And because for the last 100 years, this has been the norm, it's really hard for people to break out of that. You
Yeah.
also have the fact that it's free, quote unquote, that it's being paid for by our taxes. It's very hard to compete with free. But I think the situation is changing now.
Hmm.
COVID really was a turning point. You've had millions of families flee this system over the last few years, and
Yeah.
in the years to come, millions more are going to flee. The only reason that hasn't shown up as catastrophically as it would have otherwise is because they got the border wide open and they're filling those empty seats with freshly arrived victims. So it's a terrible situation, but I'm glad that moms and dads are waking up.
I do. And I see that. And I think some of it is too, people just really have a hard time believing that some of this is happening until it really comes knocking at their door. And then when it knocks at their door, their eyes are opened and they're like, wow, not only do I see this, but I see everything else. And to your point about COVID. So let's talk about your book. We're going to be on this great history lesson. Indoctrinating Our Children to Death gives a thorough history of public education. And government education, as we know it today, began around 1837. Wow. I mean, I think a lot of us would have thought maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, this is when it was all hitting. But no, this goes back to 1837. And how were Americans educated before then? What's the history? What's the landscape of this before the government schools came in?
Yeah, that for me was a real learning experience, figuring
Wow.
out what education looked like before the government took over. And it's fascinating because we had the best educated population in all of human history. We had almost 100% literacy in our big cities, even out in the rural areas. We had 90, 95, 98% literacy rates before the government ever got involved in education. We had people who not only were highly literate, but they were incredibly moral. A really interesting Frenchman came over here. He's well known to some of us, Alexis de Tocqueville, in the 1830s. And he was astounded. He said every citizen is getting the elementary notions of human knowledge. They're being taught the doctrines and evidences of their religion, the history of their country, the leading features of the Constitution, writing, reading, math. These things were taken for granted. Dupont de Nemours in 1812 did a literacy survey. He found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young people could write legibly, even neatly. So less
Yeah.
than 4 in 1,000 young
Wow.
people couldn't write properly, right? And now you fast forward to today, nobody's being taught the evidences and doctrines of their religions, the leading features of the Constitution, the history of their country. The vast majority of us can't write legibly, even neatly. So we have radically changed. And really, if you go back to before the government took over, you had primarily parents doing the bulk of education. I've started collecting the old school books that parents would use to teach their children, things like the Blueback Speller, the New England Primer. So they were getting their letters, they were getting a basic theology lesson, right? Like to start off with, they'd learn that in Adam's fall, we sinned all. So they're learning their letters, they're learning basic theology. The Bible was the primary textbook. And I encourage people to go back and look at the tests that these kids were doing, 14, 15 to get into college. Look at the letters they were writing to each other at 15, 16, 17 years of age. It was like the difference between night and day. And so moms and dads, aunts, uncles, older siblings, grandparents were the primary educators of the vast majority of young people in this country, including the vast majority of our founding fathers. And to the extent that outsiders participated in that education, you really had primarily the churches. Alexis de
Hmm.
Tocqueville said, other than families and parents, almost all education was in the hands of the clergy, which was true. So we
Right.
had an incredible education non-system. And then the government really started taking over beginning in Massachusetts, as you said, in 1837. That was the first real advent of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. And really, it was all downhill from there.
Okay. And two, right? The churches weren't being controlled by a 501c3.
Right.
So all of this was just everybody was teaching their morals and their convictions, and they had their hand, they were in charge, unlike now. So let's talk about 1837 then. What you said everything changed dramatically there. What were their goals? And I guess it kind of snuck in and then it's progressed ever since, clearly.
Yes, and I even go back before 1837 because what happened in 1837 was a critical turning point. The legislature of Massachusetts appointed a man, Horace Mann, to become the first ever Secretary of Education for any state. No state in America had ever had a Secretary of Education. In fact, no state in America had really been involved much in education, so this wasn't a thing. But 1837 was a critical turning point. It was a milestone on the road to what we have today. But before we get to 1837, I want to back up just a little bit and give
Okay.
some of the background. So, the first guy that I can ever find a record of promoting the idea that government should be involved in education was actually Plato. And, a lot of people who don't read Plato think he's very sophisticated. If you read what he wrote in the Republic, I mean, he was a tyrant. He was a totalitarian. He thought some of us were better than others, and philosopher kings should rule over us and basically educate children through the state to be obedient serfs. But,
Mhm.
fast forward a few thousand years. You get to another totalitarian, Robert Owen, really interesting guy who was incredibly prominent at the time. He was very wealthy. He had married into a wealthy textile manufacturing family. And he, of course, rejected the Bible and he rejected the principles that came from the Bible, including family, including private property, right, where God says, thou shalt not steal, pretty basic stuff. So he rejected all of that. And he actually became what we would call today a communist before Karl Marx came on the scene, before any of the more well-known communists today were even starting to write their drivel. So he actually believed so fervently in this stuff. He set up a commune in Indiana. You can still see kind of the signs and the ruins of it today. It was called New Harmony. And unsurprisingly, it failed in less than 2 years because
Mhm.
communism is stupid and it never works.
Right.
But he concluded not that communism was stupid, not that his ideas about getting rid of private property and the family were bad. He concluded the reason it didn't work is because these members of his commune had been raised by individualistic Christian parents, and that the solution to that was to have the government educate the children. So this.
Aha.
Mhm.
Yes, that's the key.
That's where the idea came from, right? And
Yeah.
so, I mean, to put this in perspective for folks, this was an incredibly radical idea at the time. Government played virtually no role at all in education. So to say, hey, parents and churches, why don't you hand over the children to the state for educate? That was incredibly radical, right? People were reading their Bible. They understood the purpose of government was to punish evil, not to educate your kids or babysit your kids or transgenderize them. So that was a really radical idea. Now, Robert Owen, when he started going out and telling people about this, he started writing essays. It wasn't very popular, but we know quite a bit from his autobiography, at least his account of it. He wrote these essays, and one of them was picked up by the ambassador from Prussia, and he took it back to Prussia, handed it to the Prussian dictator. It was called On the Formation of Human Character, where he argued that the best government would be the one that assumed the responsibility of educating the children and educated them to be good, model, obedient, productive citizens. So the dictator of Prussia, he was still smarting from losing a war with Napoleon, and he wanted better soldiers, better obedient serfs, if you will. And so he actually ordered his interior minister. Robert Owen says that the dictator so much approved of these ideas that he ordered his interior minister to start setting up really what became the first ever government school system, again, of the state, by the state, and for the state.
Wow.
And in America, he knew that this would take time. So he set up a network, a group of people who were to fan across the country and start preparing the way for government schools. Their goals, according to a whistleblower, Orestes Brownson, were to change public opinion in favor of having the government involved, and also to get men elected to legislatures who would support that idea. Now, this
Wow.
whistleblower also gave away the end game, and this is huge. I think you cannot understand where we are today without understanding this. the whistleblower, Orsis Brownson. He became a Catholic and repented of his involvement. He had been organizing in the state of New York. He said the ultimate objective was to get rid of Christianity. So they saw Christianity as a really strong barrier to these
Sure.
utopian communistic ideals. And really that's the genesis. So he went to Prussia. Horace Mann, when he got himself appointed as Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, actually took the Prussian system and imported it into Massachusetts. So that's where these ideas came from, and that really is the genesis of what we have today. And it took many generations to get where we're at today, but that's where it all started.
Wow. I mean, what a journey. And so targeted and such so planned, right?
It was, yep,
Yeah,
and
this
very,
was
very cunning, very secretive. In fact, Orsis Brownson said this network was set up on the model of the Carbonari, which was really a ruthless and very nasty secret society that existed in Italy. So they knew that, openly saying, "Hey, give us your children. We're going to educate them to be little communists who reject the Bible." They would have been tarred and feathered for that. So they had to
sure.
operate secretly. They had to never give away the end goal. But
Mhm.
thankfully, Orsis Brownson defected from this movement and blew the whistle, and that's really where we have most of our information about the nefarious activities that they were engaged in.
Wow. Okay, so now I want to kind of keep going here because this is you talked about Horace. I just want to make sure I'm talking about the same Horace Mann that was one of the early founders of public education, right?
Yep.
Claimed that the educators were entitled to look upon this. This is quote, entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
And
I'm shocked to even read this, but it almost sounds like Joe Biden, what he's saying when the children are ours when they come to school. So I guess I'm not shocked.
Yep. And this is a very common theme. It goes all the way back to Plato. This idea that, children are not the responsibility of their parents, that, children belong to all of us, as Melissa Harris Perry said on MSNBC. Totalitarians of all varieties, the National Socialists in Germany, right, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, the communists in the Soviet Union, the communists in China, Cuba, Angola, Mozambique, Cambodia, doesn't matter. These totalitarians always regard children as collective property. And Karl Marx was very clear about this. At the time that he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he said all children should be educated in public schools, government-controlled schools. That was really radical back then. And he
Mhm.
truly regarded parents as kind of an inconvenience in the move of society, the evolution of society toward this great new age. And so they regard children not as a parental responsibility, but as tools, as weapons for bringing about their vision of society, their master plan.
Yeah, it is really appalling. And we do hear this same message just repackaged in today's culture, clearly. You talk a lot about, you just touched on that collectivism often in your book, and it's something that you try to explain to everyone. I just want to make sure that we understand what that term is. You touched on it just now, but this is it's a conflict on every level. I mean, we know now, right? The view of religion and God. We know now that they want to take the children and train and teach so they can control and manipulate them, I guess, basically. And collectivism is really such an important term because this is kind of is that kind of the umbrella of it all?
It is. Godlessness and collectivism, I think, are really the driving ideologies behind this. And of course, there's a theology to it as well. If you fast forward just a few generations, so Horace Mann went around the country preaching the good news of salvation by government schools. And little by little, the states started joining. They started hopping on this bandwagon. And then by the turn of the century, you have a guy come on the scene called John Dewey. Now, this is a
Yeah.
guy who's also a communist. He actually visited the Soviet Union. So unlike Horace Mann, who liked the Prussian system, John Dewey adored the Soviet system, and he wrote openly about it. That's the amazing thing. That this murderous, monstrous system was actually John Dewey's model. He talked about how this, collectivistic mentality being instilled in the children, and so the
Mm.
theology of it all. John Dewey got together with about 30 of his buddies, mostly academics psychologists, early progressives, ministers in the Unitarian movement, and that's where Horace Mann comes out of as well. They deny the Trinity and so on.
Right.
And they actually outlined this new religion, or what they thought was a new religion. They called it the Humanist Manifesto. Really significant document
Okay.
if you want to understand the underpinnings. And if you read it, it sounds a lot like communism. He talks about we have to restructure the economy, we have to change the motives, get rid of the profit motive as the driving force in the economy. Talks about redistributing and making equitable the control of the means of life, which Karl Marx would have said having collective ownership of the means of production. Basically, government should run the economy. But then there's some really important theological principles as well. The very first
Okay.
tenet in John Dewey's religious manifesto was we religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So, from a theological perspective, that's a direct, full frontal assault on the very first words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created. Right? So
Yes.
fundamentally different worldviews, fundamentally different theological perspectives, and you don't even have to be a Bible scholar to arrive at the conclusions that you have in Genesis 1. Our founding fathers actually said in the Declaration of Independence that these truths are self-evident, that God
Hmm.
created us, that God gave us rights, right? The right to
Yes.
life, the right to liberty, the right to property, the right to pursue happiness. And the collectivists reject all of that. First of all, there is no God.
Right.
Second of all, even if there was a God, who do you think you are to have a right to pursue your own happiness? You have to participate in our plan because our plan is better than anything that you might come up with yourself. You're a doofus. You do what we tell you. So that's really collectivism at its core, right? You deny individual
Mm.
rights, you deny individual choice, and you try to make everybody in society participate in this grandiose plan that supposedly is going to lead to a utopia, which, they're always one execution away from utopia, right?
Unreal. I mean, shocking, but not shocking. But when you're talking about Dewey, right, there was this essay in 1898, The Primary Education Fetish, right? And he said that he is strongly against the then heavy emphasis on reading, writing, and arithmetic in the younger years. It produced highly literate, independent minded individuals with faith in God and freedom. And these principles are the principles that have made America great. So he was really, I mean, this is what we always say. They're saying this in plain sight. We're not listening and we're not watching because they surely say it out loud. And I guess we're just not paying attention because this was very clear and it's clear today.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's so amazing about this is you don't have to speculate. You don't have to connect dots. You don't
You
have to be a
don't have
fly
to
on the wall of
speculate.
their
Yeah.
secret meeting. They told us what they were doing, right? And I'm glad you brought up the primary education fetish. This is smoking gun evidence that John Dewey, and many of his buddies, by the way, had a plan to dumb down the American population. Just like his predecessors, just like Horace Mann and Robert Owen, John Dewey viewed Americans as way too individualistic. They were too concerned about their own desires, their own family, their own business, their own farm, and they weren't sufficiently concerned with the community. And he believed that early education, parents really drilling into their children how to read, how to write, how to study the Bible, he believed that was a major contributing factor. He talks about how, when you're reading, it's a very individual activity. It's just you and the text, you and the author of the
Mhm.
text. And so he really wanted, in this essay, The Primary Education Fetish, he outlines this plan to really de-emphasize that. In fact, he almost calls for abolishing outright. But then he says something really critical. Again, more smoking gun evidence of the mindset of these people. He says these changes must come gradually. To force it
Mm,
unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So
a
he understood
violent
if right,
reaction.
he understood that if parents, moms, dads, pastors, taxpayers understood what these people were up to, they would have gotten violent. That's how
Right.
dangerous these ideas
They would
were.
have there would have been an uprising. But if you
Absolutely.
give it piece you give them piece by piece and bite by bite, all of a sudden they're in it like you're saying and they're boiling.
That's
They're the
exactly
frog.
right. And so John Dewey teams up to implement these ideas with a very unlikely individual. So as I mentioned, John Dewey was really a collectivist to the core. He loved the Soviet system and actually wrote all these essays and articles about how wonderful it was after going there. He teams up with None other than John D. Rockefeller, the robber baron. It's almost like the start
Mm.
of a bad joke, right? You've got a communist and a super capitalist walk into a bar. What happens? So John Rockefeller gives John Dewey $3.1 million through this newly created philanthropic entity, the General Education Board, and says, hey, start up an experimental school at the University of Chicago. Let's try out these crazy ideas of yours and see what happens. And so they do this, and they graduate a bunch of kids who can't read, and they were using quack methodology that we go through in the book. It's the reason why half of adult Americans today are basically functionally illiterate. So they graduate a bunch of kids who can't read, can't write, can't do math, can't tell right from wrong, and they say, "Wow, this will be perfect. Let's do this at the national level." Now, they don't have the same end goal in mind. Rockefeller is really interested in dumbed down worker drones. In fact, the guy he put in charge of his philanthropies, Frederick Gates, we don't need these kids philosophizing about government and statesmanship and
Mm.
theology. We need them to work hard and just, turn the screw when they're told to turn the screw, and, leave the important stuff to us. John Dewey, of course, had a slightly different vision. He wanted a society where collectivism would reign supreme, and
Right.
you can't have individualistic thinkers and readers because they might not like your plan. So you have this very weird convergence of interest from communists and super capitalists, and that really laid the foundation of a system that quite literally dumbed down almost our
Mm.
entire population over a century.
Wow. So these foundations and I, I guess when money, then you put money with a bad idea or in a bad movement, and then obviously it can take off. I just have one quick question. Where was these single room schoolhouses that we see? Where, where was that in all of this? Because those seemed okay, but were
Yeah.
they?
Well, I think a lot of them were. We have a
Okay.
long tradition of one-room schoolhouses in this country, but they weren't government schools. That's the important thing
Right.
to remember. If you
They were
go back,
community schools,
they were, and,
probably
and
led by the
primarily church
church.
school. Exactly. All right.
Right. Okay.
Primarily the church was overseeing these. And that's true going back to the very, very beginning. You look at the first Education Act that was ever passed in North America. These were the Pilgrims, the Puritans up in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Right.
And the best way to think of this colony, it's like a Bible colony. It was like a religious group moved over here and said, hey, we're going to practice our faith and we're going to set up a government that is exactly in accord with our faith. And so the first law they ever passed dealing with education was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. It's a fascinating law. I encourage people to read it themselves. It's really interesting. And the
Did you say
premise,
Satan? What did you say?
the Old Deluder Satan Act.
Okay, it is what you said. Okay,
Yeah.
I was
And,
like,
and,
did I miss that?
Well, and it
Satanic.
gives you
Okay.
some insight into their beliefs. So they believed, and they said this in the text of the law. They said one of the chief projects of that old deluder, Satan, is to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures. And so they said it's important that everybody in this colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, know how to read so that they can read their Bible so that Satan doesn't deceive them. Now, they had a little bit of a different perspective on that issue than maybe we would today. They were coming from Europe, the religious persecution, etc. But the point holds. They wanted everybody to read
Yeah.
because they wanted people to read their Bible. And so they commanded parents to make sure their children could read. And they also urged the towns, which were led by the elders of the church, to make sure that all the parents were actually teaching their children to read. And so oftentimes you would have
Mm.
the one-room schoolhouse taking place at the church where the pastor or somebody appointed by the pastor would check on the children, make sure they had learned how to read or help them along so that they could read their Bible. So the Bible
Yeah.
was their primary textbook. The Bible was really central to everything they were doing, to their
Amen.
government, to their church. And that was a totally different system than what was born under Horace Mann. And
Right.
that really was what happened in a lot of towns. If you go back into American history, you had a group of Presbyterians would settle here, a group of Baptists would settle here, a group of Lutherans would settle here, and their church would run a one-room schoolhouse. But it
Hmm.
wasn't anything like today. Maybe you would
Correct.
come a few weeks a year when you weren't picking crops with your parents or helping on the farm. But totally, totally different system,
Right.
primarily run by parents and the church,
Right.
radically different from the government coming in and say, hey, give us money, give us your children. We'll be in charge of educating them for you.
Correct. Correct. Again, government control versus parental control, and the church. The church really has. It's a whole different topic, but the church has been lost in this culture too. Boy, do we need the church more than ever.
Amen.
Let's talk about the National Education Association. The NEA has been overtaken. You know, it, I mean, I guess their plan has been to establish and control and create organizations that would support their agenda. clearly.
Absolutely. And we got a whole chapter on the NEA in the book. And it actually started off as quite an innocuous organization. It didn't
Okay.
start off as a
They
terrible
didn't start out
monster
as
that
the
we see
bad
today.
guys. Okay.
No, they did. They started off just as a kind of a professional association for teachers. I mean, it really had very little in common with what we have today. But it was gradually taken over by the radical ideologues. It got
Right.
to the point where they actually made John Dewey their honorary life president. So that should tell you kind of how quickly this
Okay.
metamorphosis happened. And then they were at the forefront of promoting every bad idea that you can think of in education. NEA was
Unreal.
at the forefront of promoting it, whether that be the emergence of UNESCO, the UN Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization that really now dominates education around the world, whether that be the creation of the U.S. Department of Education. I mean, that was their project, right?
Yeah.
And what's so amazing about the NEA is just like with the founders of this government school system, they told us what they were doing. You can read their
Right.
newsletters, you can read the speeches that were given at their conferences. They're openly talking about abolishing capitalism, getting parents out of the way, world government. Man, they said that openly. Why wasn't that on the front page of every newspaper? People never would have consented to this. And the same is true today. You look at
Right.
these NEA conferences, these are, I mean, no offense, but these are raging lunatics and totalitarians who are foaming at the mouth, shrieking about, we want your children, they need to be transgenderized. You're like, what is wrong with these people? This should be
Unreal.
on the front page of every newspaper, but people don't know.
Even just now with the DOJ saying that, parents that are going to school boards are domestic terrorists. I mean, again, that's our government saying that about parents. US Department of Education, part of the problem, this just goes on, bigger, right? They built it and they just fed it and fed it and fed it. Reminds me of what happens when like when you put yeast in something and it just grows and it just literally takes over. And all of a sudden you cannot stop it. That's the problem, isn't it?
That's exactly the problem. And now we're dealing with $1 trillion a year machine.
Sure.
It's very hard for parents who are being labeled terrorists, who are struggling to pay the mortgage with the out of control inflation, who are just trying to feed their children and provide a decent life for their family. It's very hard for parents to fight against $1 trillion a year
Right.
monster that is intent on really destroying their children spiritually, morally, academically, in every possible way, mentally, psychologically. How does a parent go up against that?
Yeah.
It's really, it's not a David versus Goliath. It's like a David versus an army of Goliaths with $1 trillion a year tax funding.
Right. And then you look at the elections with the teachers union and just, it just goes on and on and on. Let's talk about what's happening now too, real quick. I know we're so glad to have you and we'll have to get the book. But the problems right now that we're seeing, this was their goal. I know Common Core, No Child Left Behind. We've got Race to the Top. We've got all of these. We've got the indoctrination. We've got the separating of children with their parents. Now parents can't come in. They can't ask questions. They can't show up. There's all of this attack on the parents' parental rights, clearly, and then all of these agendas. We talk about this all the time, but it's not stopping, and it's only getting worse.
Yeah, and it's going to continue to get worse until
Right.
parents do really the only thing that they can do still and protect their children, which is pull them out.
Right.
It has gotten so bad. You almost can't even describe how bad it is because then you're getting into things that you can't talk about. I mean, some of the things, the perversions that they're teaching children. I just did an article last week about they were caught teaching ninth grade girls in Australia about bestiality. In California, they were teaching kids about pedophilia as if it were a sexual orientation. I've got the assistant superintendent on video defending the teaching of pedophilia to children because it was a sexual orientation that existed in history.
Mhm.
So it's really important that we teach these things. I mean, this is disgusting.
Right.
So they're instilling in them
Disgusting.
a godless worldview. They're teaching them that life has no meaning. These are theological ideas that have consequences. They're teaching them that their life is no more valuable than the life of their pet goldfish. They're teaching them that their parents are backwards and they're responsible for white supremacy and climate change and all the systemic
Right.
oppression. So this is a war against your children.
This is a war.
And I tell people the system is actually designed to destroy your kids. And once you understand that, you realize no, the system's not broken. It's actually working pretty well when you understand what the purpose is. And so, folks, again, I'll repeat what I said at the start. This is the most critical issue that we are facing as a nation.
Yeah. And now when you see what they're doing with the gender confusion and taking the children that maybe are on the spectrum or shy or awkward or whatever it may be, in puberty, just confused about life, and this new agenda of just trying to make them, mold them, and push them into something. And then again, not letting their parents know this is happening all over this country. And it is shocking and it is appalling. So much so that we are either showing up at the school boards and trying to hold them accountable, but a lot of parents are literally taking their kids out of school. I know we took our youngest out. My other two kids went to public school, and I know that there were things that were happening, but we didn't see it as much as we do now. And it's been like it's like on steroids what they're doing. It's just you turn around and you're like, what in God's green earth is happening here?
Yeah, it is worse than parents can possibly begin to imagine. They are using highly advanced psychological manipulation techniques,
It's like
behavioral
warfare.
conditioning. It is, and your children are in the crosshairs. And they're taking a century of psychological research, behavioral conditioning, and they're now applying it to children using highly sophisticated technology, including artificial intelligence, including very advanced data gathering techniques, things like facial expression cameras. And they're taking all this and they're weaponizing it against your children,
They are.
ultimately aiming to weaponize your children against your family, against your church, and against your country. And it's gotten to the point where they are now so successful. The latest data that we've seen out of the Nehemiah Institute, something like 80 to 90% of Christian children who spend 12 years in a government school are going to leave the faith and they're going to leave the church. Not to mention, they're going to be dumb as a
Yeah.
box of rocks, according to the government's own data. This is a catastrophe of unspeakable proportions.
It's so overwhelming. You just wonder, where America will be, but we do have faith in the fighters here and the moms that are just really fighting back and pushing back against this. And I think the thing that's so hard is that I think sometimes by the time it happens, the kids already they've moved into this ideology themselves, and then the parents are trying to fix it. But we've got to get ahead of it, and that's why your book is so important. Let's talk about the options. And we have private school, we have homeschooling. I mean, there's all kinds. School is so different. We talk about having parallel societies, right? Even in medical, and in our shopping, where we spend our dollar, and we've got to have this parallel society now with education. So, what about the parents that are working? What about the parents that can afford homeschool or home private school? There are some obvious challenges, but there's all kinds of new ideas that are just on the forefront and making education possible, different education.
Yeah, there are. There's never been a better time to pull your children out of school. It's there's so many options out there, and I start from the position of warning people. Like I use admittedly poor analogy. Like the school building is on fire. Your
Yeah.
children are trapped inside, and everybody listening to
Yes.
my voice right now knows this. They hear the children screaming. Even if you pretend like you don't, even if you try really hard not to, you hear your children suffering and screaming. And so, what do you do in a situation like that? The answer is self-evidently not run for school board or lobby your state legislature. I mean, those are all good things. Those are all fine things. And I encourage people to do that. But the first priority when your child is in a burning building is to
Get your
get
child
that child
safe.
out
Yeah.
immediately, even if you sacrifice your life doing it. People say, "Oh, I don't know that we can afford it," and they got the BMW sitting in the front yard, they got the
Hmm.
ski vacation in Colorado. What do you mean you can't afford it? We live in the richest society in human history. I mean, our
Right.
goat herding ancestors 2,000 years ago could educate their children and disciple their children, and we can't. We've got three color TVs in our 4,000 square foot air conditioned home, really? So you,
Hmm.
you start from the premise that your children are being systematically harmed. And
Right.
I say the burning building is a poor analogy because a burning building doesn't really do justice to the severity of this. A
Yeah.
burning building might hurt your children physically. That's true. I mean, don't act like your children aren't being hurt physically now. Suicide is now the leading cause of death in
Right.
certain age groups, second leading cause in the rest. They're mutilating themselves. The boys are being castrated. Girls are being given
Sure.
hysterectomies, mastectomies.
The violence in the schools, I mean, the teachers are being, I mean, it is a violent place, the schools in so many places
It absolutely
on
is. I
every
mean,
level.
the U.S. Department of Education did a survey 2 decades ago. They don't do any more, I think, because they don't want to know the answer. They found that 1 in 10 children in government schools were being sexually assaulted and molested by a faculty member. That doesn't even count the
Yeah.
kids who are being raped
We've
by
heard
other
this too.
kids. So,
Yes.
so your children are being hurt physically. In fact, many of them are actually dying, right? And again, the numbers are appalling. The CDC says suicide is now the leading or the second leading cause
So
of death
sad.
among children. This would have been unthinkable even a generation ago. So yeah, they're being hurt physically. Some of them are being killed, but they're also being destroyed mentally, emotionally, spiritually,
Yeah.
academically. So the burning building analogy doesn't cut it, but you got to get them out. And once you think of it in those terms, it's not like, well, what would I do with my child for 8 hours if I pulled him out of a burning building? You're not thinking about those things. You first
Mm,
do the urgent thing, and then you solve those secondary issues. I
right.
will encourage people that there are lots of resources available.
There
A
sure
lot
is.
of the great private schools have scholarships available. A lot of homeschool organizations have scholarships
Hmm.
available. Talk to grandparents, talk to aunts and uncles, talk to neighbors, get together with the homeschool co-ops, talk to your pastor.
Hmm.
There are so many options out there right now. And people make the mistake of thinking that they have to do government school at home. So they need, 7 hours of instruction followed by 3 hours of homework. Baloney. I mean, in less than an hour or two a day, your children will be light years ahead of the victims of government schools. And then they can do other stuff. They can start a business. They can read books. I mean, they can hang out with their friends. All
Yeah.
kinds of fun stuff they could do. So we have to break the paradigm that we've been conditioned to accept. We have to rethink even the most
Right.
fundamental questions, like what is the purpose of education? And again, there are tons of resources out there to help you, whether you need a scholarship, whether you need a support group, whether you need a Christian school.
They are.
Almost any
Yes.
community in America will have these things available to you.
And we do. We have a monthly homeschool mom to mom where we, just help mentor our moms that are homeschooling. And again, private education, you just got to be careful because not all private education is safe either.
That's
If
right.
so we do have to be careful. We did a lot of investigation where we sent our son and boy, did we go there with our questions and wanted to know what their agendas were. So there are great private schools if you can afford them, and there are scholarships and homeschooling options are beautiful. And I believe that the churches are rising up, Alex, right? In different states now, like from Florida, across the country. I'm in Illinois, so there's no school choice here. But I do want to talk about that school choice and those vouchers and what you think about those, because there's some people have pros and cons to this. Well, if you take a voucher from the government, then they're going to actually have some kind of input, and then others say, well, no, they don't. There's no strings attached. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, happy to. And I think this is a really important issue. And I'm actually very glad that the national discussion is moving in this direction, right? I just published a piece in Newsweek yesterday about this very issue. And the subject has now shifted. It used to be like, how do we fix the schools, right? How do we put out the
Mhm.
fire? Now the question is, how do we rescue the children? How do we get them out? And this is the
Yes.
discussion we should be having. Now, I will start off by saying a lot of the people that are promoting the vouchers and the government funding for homeschooling and private schools, these are decent, honorable, great people who just want to get the children out. And on that issue, we see eye to eye. My concern comes with the issue of control. Historically, and
Yes.
this is true in all societies everywhere, what the government funds, the government wants to control. That's ubiquitous throughout all of human history. And
Mhm.
we're already seeing some really, really urgent warning signs about this very issue. As soon as you start taking the government money, they want to start collecting data on your children. In Arizona, they passed the universal ESAs. Now the governor's saying anybody who's taken that money has to submit to the same government standards, has to take the government tests, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. And UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, they put out a report a couple of years ago that I have. I wrote an article about this where they encourage governments to start giving tax money to private schools, what they call non-state education providers. And they say why. The purpose, they said, is to impose the equity goals, to bring them into the national testing
Mm.
regime, to impose non-discrimination in hiring standards. So you have to hire, a guy in a dress to teach your kindergarten class.
Oh,
So
the
there are
DEA or
exactly.
DEI. I'm sorry.
hmm
Yeah.
and so this is a big risk. And again, I don't say this out of malice. I love a lot of the people that are promoting these
Mhm.
ideas. In fact, I've got a lot of friends in politics who think this is the way to go, and I'm glad the discussion's moving in this direction. But I would just put that word of caution out there. You want to, in my opinion, stay as far from the government as you possibly can. And I think over the long term, this may be, a stopgap measure while we figure out how to get the kids out. But over the long term, I think we really need to go back to thinking about education as primarily a family and parent
Mhm.
responsibility. So, when we think of feeding our children, when we think of housing our children, when we think of disciplining our children, we don't think, hey, the government should help me with this, right? We just know
Mhm.
that, well, we cook dinner for our children. We put a roof over
Yes.
our home.
We've
And
lost this. We've
we
lost
should.
this. Yeah, we've
Yep.
lost
And
this
that's how we
ideal.
should think about education. It is mom and dad's responsibility. And if we need help, we're not going to turn to Big Daddy government. We're going to turn to our neighbors, our extended family, our church community. If you're not involved in a church, maybe, your local nonprofit organizations, your
Right.
community organizations. This is how it existed before. And we were the best educated people in all of human history anywhere on the planet. We can do it again, but we have to change the way we think about the issue of education and the whole system more broadly.
Right. Well, your quote, with shekels come shackles, right?
Yep.
So there's always some kind of connecting to this. And again, I do hope that we can work through a lot of these this new ideas, in a better way. And we can hold those vouchers or those opportunities or education. We have to look at it differently. We have to ask the right questions. We have to take it. Now, parents just got to get back in the game. Number
Yep.
one, look at your wife. 5 kids. She's homeschooling. God bless her. And baby on the way.
Yep. And we are tremendously blessed. I really, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. There's no amount of money that you could give my wife and I to send our children off to be educated and raised by the government. It's just, there's
Yeah,
nothing you could do. I would live in a cardboard box before I would send them to
true.
a public school. So it's a great joy. And I tell parents, you just follow the Lord, follow what you
Amen.
know is right, and a way will be provided. You can make it happen. You may have to be creative. You're going to have to make some sacrifices. It's
Right,
true. But what could be more valuable than your children and the
right.
well-being of your children?
Right. And you know what? There's so many options now too. I mean, moms can do a little bit of part-time, at home, over the internet now. You can, there's all kinds of different ways now. So many people are working from home. So, if you're homeschooling and you homeschool half the day and you got to do a little bit of side work to help with the contribution, there is so many opportunities now. It's so different. It's not like it used to be. Every mom is not leaving the home now, which is great. Thank
Yep.
God. You
Yep.
know?
And you can, adjust your schedule.
Right,
Mom works a little bit in the day, dad goes to work, they
right.
switch places, take care of the children, bring in grandma and grandpa to help for a couple of days a week, drop them off at a co-op 2 days a week. There's so many options now, and the freedom that you get, but just the
Mhm.
freedom. I forget the
Yeah,
closer family bonds, the love that grows, just
that's
the
right.
freedom of like, hey, let's go to the beach today, or hey, let's take a trip to another city or another country. Let's go study Roman architecture. If you have the money to do that, the freedom that you get from opting
Right.
out of this whole system is just the joy of it, the blessing that it is just incalculable. You can't put it into words.
And I think the well-being and the health of your child, I think sometimes we forget that really all children want is their mom and dad. They want their home to be stable. They want to know that someone's got their arms around them. They need parameters. I think sometimes we forget how special a home is. And that's what we do here at Moms for America, too, is just, moms, you are the greatest influencers, and dads, you are the greatest protectors and educators. So we have got to just kind of come back to the basics. And I'm praying for a turnaround all across our country. Tell us about your book before we go. I know we'll make sure we mention it in the beginning, but I want to make sure people know how they can get it.
Well, thank you so much. So it's called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. Incredibly honored by the folks who have endorsed it, including, by the way, Kimberly Fletcher, the head of Moms for America. We so appreciate her. We've
Right.
also got, Kirk Cameron, General Michael Flynn, Pete Hegseth, co-host of Fox and Friends. I was actually astounded by how many high-profile people
Um,
were willing to put their name on this. So we really appreciate it. The foreword was actually written by the Honorable Diane Douglas. She was the most recent superintendent of all the public schools in Arizona. And after 4 years at the helm of Arizona's public school system, she said it can't be reformed. Alex is right. Get your kids out. And so you can get it at Amazon is the easy place, bookstores. You can also get it if you want a signed copy and you're willing to wait a little bit longer. You can get it through my website at libertysentinel.org. And then a lot of great ministries and organizations are selling it as well. But those are some of the places.
Thank you for being such a powerful voice out there. Everybody really does appreciate just you educating us, and I guess doing all the hard work, bringing it to us in a book, and letting us know exactly where we started, where we're going, and where we're at. So thank you, Alex. God bless you guys, and
God
God
bless
bless
you
that
too.
baby that's coming too.
Well, thank you so much. What an honor to be with you. Thanks to all the Moms for America. You guys are such a blessing to our country, to your families. And tell you what, from me and from my wife, we appreciate you so much. We love you, and God bless you.
Thanks. We're all in it together. Thank you so
Amen.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. What an incredible interview. Moms, you have got to share this with your mama friends. If you're a grandma, share this with your daughter and your son. I mean, if kids are in your sphere, we've got to be addressing education. What a great interview. Again, you can catch that book at Amazon or on Alex's website. I'm going to go ahead right now and I'm going to do a giveaway. So if you email me at podcast@momsforamerica.net. I'm going to take the very first email. I'm going to throw in a couple of surprises from Moms for America, and I'm going to get you a signed copy of Alex's book. Again, the first person to email me at podcast@momsforamerica.net will have the book coming in the mail along with some special surprises from Moms for America. Not sure what they are yet, but they'll be great. All righty. I do want to remind everybody that Moms for America, we are here to help you make a difference in your home and in your community and in your country. We want to go ahead and remind you once again to visit our website, momsforamerica.net. Sign up for our weekly newsletter. That's how you get our blogs, our upcoming events, our seminars, webinars, and also our podcasts. So please go ahead and sign up for that. When you do stop by our website, check out all of our incredible resources and information. Check out our cottage meetings. That is our special signature series, which you will absolutely love. It's 12 lessons that will inspire and educate you about America's amazing heritage so you can teach those principles of liberty in your home and in your community. This program, along with all of our other programs and webinars and seminars and information from booklets to everything you can imagine, everything that will help you be a better mama in your home. They are all at Moms for America. From parental rights to public policy, from the kitchen table to the school boardroom, we are here helping you along the way. We say this every week, moms. We believe wholeheartedly that liberty begins at home and that you, moms, you are the heartbeat of your home and the heartbeat of our country. So again, we are here to encourage you along the way. So please share this podcast with Alex, with your mom friends. Please like, subscribe, and share. Even write a review about the podcast. We would so appreciate that. Join me next week for another inspiring and informative discussion with moms just like you. Moms, as I always say every week, let's keep changing our world one home at a time. God bless you. Thanks.